Good morning, and welcome again to 365 Days of Amazing Stories with Theo Mayer. We are continuing today with a story being told by the second calendar, and he's now telling the story of the envious man and the envied. Remember, the prince was trying to get out of dying the hands of the genie, or being transformed into something other than a man. And so he offered a story to the genie, and the genie, beyond all hopes, decided he wanted to hear the story. And so the prince began. Once there were two neighbors living next door to each other. And the one became envious of the other. All he had, his joy, his stance with life, his friends, everything that the one saw in the other, he hated. And he made the other's life so miserable that the man decided to leave and move somewhere else. And so he headed off toward the capital of that country. And he found a place that was about 15 or 20 minutes outside of the city. And there he bought a piece of land and a beautiful house. And he decided that he would devote himself to God and became a dervish. And he equipped the house not only for himself, but to become somewhat of a monastery for others who wanted to be dervishes. Now, things that went on in that house were amazing. The dancing, the praising of God, and, the reputation of this man became quite great because he seemed to have a beautiful effect on everyone that came into his presence. He accepted each day for what it was, lived in the moment, and valued more highly than anything, giving love. And that's what he did to everyone that he met, to everyone that he interacted with. He treated them all with an uplifting attitude, uplifting words. Well, his reputation having also spread to that envious neighbor that he once had. And hearing about all the wonderful things that had happened to him, the neighbor felt that hatred rising up in him again. He began to think about what he could do to bring this saint-like man down. Finally came up with a plan. And dressing himself as a dervish himself, he made off to the monastery of his, imagined enemy. And when he got there, he was greeted by his enemy himself. The founder of the dervish hall came and met him and welcomed him into the hall and gave him a room that he could stay in for the night. The envious man told the other, "I have something of great import that I must tell the founder himself." Well, the founder, of course, said, "Oh, of course. Please tell me, I am the founder." The envious neighbor said, "It must be done in private. Could we meet tonight?" Well, the founder, the saintly man, said, "Yes, well, of course." So they met in the courtyard. And in the middle of the courtyard, there was an old well. It had not been used for quite a long time. And the two began to talk. And as they began to talk, The envious man moved closer and closer to this well, moving at the same time our saintly dervish as well. And when the saintly dervish was close to the edge of the well, the envious neighbor, he grabbed a hold of him and threw him down into the well. Well, there's nothing like hitting the bottom of a dry well, especially when the drop is quite far. But amazingly, our saintly dervish did not hit, because for quite some time, that well had been inhabited by spirits and genies who had nowhere else to go. And when they saw the dervish falling, knowing him for who he was, they caught him and brought him slowly down to the floor and laid him then upon it. He didn't move. And the spirits that were there began to speak. They said, "It is so sad that this beautiful man, well, there was an attempt on his own life this very day. He does not know it, but the Sultan himself was going to appear tomorrow in his presence to have cured the princess." Now, it turns out that the Sultan had a daughter, and the Sultan's daughter was basically bewitched, entranced, enthroned, and captured by the genie Mauman, and had taken possession really of her being, to the point where the princess wasn't present inside herself. And the Sultan had sought everyone to try to heal his daughter, but no one could. And finally, he thought of going to the dervish, because the dervish had such a reputation for bringing such beauty and light into people's lives. Now, the spirits had no idea that he was down there at the bottom of the well, still conscious, still able to speak and hear everything that was going on. As they continued, the one said to the other, "Yes, it is so sad, because the dervish, even though he might have met with the Sultan, he wouldn't have known what to do." And the other spirit said, "Well, what was it that he needed to do?" The other spirit said, "Well, you know the black and white cat that lives in the monastery? All he would have needed to do was pluck 7 white hairs out of its tail and burn them into smoke over the princess, and the genie would have been banned, would have been cast away forever from her presence." "Ah," said the other spirit, "that is too bad, isn't it? If we could only tell the dervish how to cure her, it would be such a wonderful thing. And certainly he does deserve it." Well, the dervish laid there on the floor. The spirits, seeing that their special beloved man was still okay, went about whatever they were doing. The dervish, he laid there through the night. And when the morning came, he saw light coming in through a crack in the well's walls. And through that crack, moving some boulders and some debris, he was able to get out from the well. Now, it turns out his envious neighbor, having thought that he had cast his Envied down into the well to his death, rejoiced and made his way home, thinking he had accomplished his goal. The dervish came out. He dusted himself off, came back into the monastery, and all of his disciples that were there, all the other dervishes, were delighted to see that he was still alive. They had no idea what had happened to him. He cleaned himself, he broke his fast for the day, and in a short amount of time, the Sultan came. Now, during the time that the dervish had eaten his breakfast, the cat had come, as was its habit, to greet his master a hello. And as he did, the dervish took advantage of that moment and plucked those 7 hairs, those 7 white hairs from the cat's tail. Well, the Sultan arrived. The dervish met him. And the dervish was able to tell him, of course, why he was there. And said, "You've come to heal the princess, have you not?" The Sultan said, "Indeed, I have. Do you think you can do it?" And the dervish said, "I believe I might be able to. Bring her into this room and let me see what I can do. You are welcome to stay." Well, they entered a room, and the daughter of the Sultan lay down upon a bed that was there, one of the rooms for a dervish. And as she did, our saintly dervish pulled the white hairs out from a pocket and brought out a taper that was lit. And over the princess, he burned those 7 hairs. And as the smoke entered the air over the princess, loud shrieking was heard, screaming, but no one could see from where it was coming from. It was, however, as the dervish had suspected, Maoman being cast away from the princess's body. But when the screaming quit, the daughter of the Sultan, she opened her eyes. Now, she'd come in heavily veiled, so heavily veiled and clothed that you couldn't tell who she was at all. Her eyes opened up and she sat up. She threw the veil from off of her face, casting off her headdress as well, and she looked around and she said, "Where am I? How have I gotten here?" Seeing her father, she felt relief, but she had no idea what had been taking place. Well, the Sultan was just delighted by what had happened. And he brought the dervish back to his palace with him, and it was decided by him and everyone else who gave him counsel that the dervish would marry his daughter, which he did. In a short amount of time, the Grand Vizier of the Sultan died, and the dervish was put in his place as Grand Vizier, and a short time after that, the Sultan died. And the Sultan, having no heir, no son, had, bestowed his position to the dervish, his son-in-law now. And that man, the dervish, now became the Sultan. And at some procession that was taking place, he eyed in the crowd his once envious neighbor. And he called to his men. He had his neighbor singled out and brought before him. And there in his court, he asked his treasurer to bestow upon his envious neighbor 1,000 gold pieces and a number of beasts of burden laden with goods to take home with him. "This, O genie, this is how you could treat me as well. You could treat me, beautifully, giving me my freedom and even gifts on top of it." Well, the genie shook his head and said, "No, let me tell you, that will never happen." He took a pile of dirt up into his hands and he threw it on the prince. And the next thing the prince knew, he was a monkey in a place that he had never seen before. And we'll leave the story there, as Scheherazade did.